Okay, good evening, everyone. Hello. Masal khair. Welcome to 19 Washington Square North, which is the intellectual center and home of NYU Abu Dhabi here in New York. Over the academic year, 19 is host to many different activities, including lectures, conferences, exhibitions, and their openings. And it also serves as a meeting place for students and faculty and members of the public to interact and learn. The NYU Abu Dhabi Institute, in particular, organizes many of the activities here that offer the Washington Square community opportunities to hear experts, to talk about their research and societal relevance, technological and cultural impact, and the importance for the world at large. And of course, today, that's very much the case. My name is Maurice Pomerantz. I'm a professor of Arabic literature at NYU Abu Dhabi and the director of the NYU Abu Dhabi Institute in Abu Dhabi. And it's my profound pleasure on behalf of my colleague, Michael Peruganen, the director of 19, that's here in New York, to welcome you today and introduce our speaker, tonight's speaker, David Lipsky. David Lipsky, Professor Lipsky, is an artist in residence with the esteemed program in creative writing here at NYU. His fiction and nonfiction have appeared in The New Yorker, Harper's Magazine, The Best American Short Stories, which they were anthologized, The Best American Magazine Writing, The New York Times Book Review, and many other publications. Professor Lipsky has written across a wide variety of forms. He's the author of a novel entitled The Art Fair, a collection of stories entitled $3,000, the best-selling nonfiction book, Absolutely American, which was a Time Magazine Best Book of the Year, and although of course you end up becoming yourself, A Road Trip with David Foster Wallace, which was a New York Times bestseller, an NPR Book of the Year, and the basis for a movie, The End of the Tour. Now, Lipsky's book, The Parrot and the Igloo, Climate and the Science of Denial, is his first venture into this territory. Yet not only is it the finest account of climate denial to date, it is one ambitious in scope that one reviewer said, likely to remain the book on the science of denial for some time to come. I thought that was very interesting, the science of denial. Lipsky instructs his readers in the introduction that they can approach the book as a Netflix series, like as the moment it drops. They may read the 3 parts independently of one another. The first part was on the sort of inventors, then the scientists, then the deniers. I discovered reading it that Lipsky's book is like a Netflix series in another way that is certainly binge-worthy. I consumed nearly all of it in one very long sitting. In a plot that stretches back to the wild inventions and innovations, I'd say, of Edison and Tesla, describes the clear-eyed warnings of scientists several decades and earlier part of the last century, like those of the chemist Sherwood Rowland, and also recounts, and it's I think the most colorful part of the book, the global warming deniers, like the would-be novelist James Delingpole and the not really Lord Monckton, who we'll hear about more today. Lipsky's book is by turns engaging and enraging. It's comic and it's tragic. Yet in this time, one thing's for certain. When the value of scientific understanding and the importance of action is ever more present, Lipsky's book is extremely important for those who care about our collective future. So thank you. Welcome.
Maurice, that was such a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And now the letting everybody down can begin. The talk is called Sherwood Rowland's Question, and I want to get there in a moment, but one way of sort of approaching his question is to, well, I'll just begin. There was an economist could neatly sum the whole problem up in October of 1995. Time Magazine, their story had a very cheery title, Headed for Apocalypse with a question mark. which is what keeps it cheery. And a professor at the Sloan School at MIT, he said, look, if you said, let's design a problem that human institutions can't deal with, you couldn't find one better than global warming. Then you can jump ahead from that 17 years. And if it were a space alien watching us through like their version of the Webb telescope, it would seem like the same person speaking in the same kind of publication, the Times, not Time magazine, and Yale at the same sort of institution at Yale and not at MIT. And the head of the Yale Project for Climate Change Communication pointed out, you almost couldn't design a problem that is a worse fit with our underlying psychology. So you're on a sense, just looking at those two data points, is that we are not making a huge amount of progress on this issue. Or you could take this, Wallace Broecker, who was a very brilliant Columbia University climate scientist. He helped popularize the phrase global warming in 1975. He had a sort of very catchy image for our trouble with climate. He said that the climate system is an angry beast and we are poking it with sticks. In 1987, he had kind of a chillier image. It was sort of like a gif of a whole culture holding a revolver to its head. He said, we play Russian roulette with the climate. I am less optimistic about the contents than many. In fact, he wasn't terribly optimistic at all. He testified that year. He said that thing about Russian roulette in Nature magazine. He testified that year before the Senate Subcommittee on Environmental Protection. And he said, I come here as the prophet. There are going to be harsh changes. Now, you'd think that that would have some sort of an effect, but we can skip ahead. It's some attention grabbing, right? Famous climatologist testifying at the Senate Subcommittee. Except we skip ahead 25 years to 2013, Steve Chu. He's a physicist. He is the former Secretary of Energy under President Obama, and he is the only member of any presidential cabinet who would be entitled to list Nobel Prize under endorsements on his LinkedIn. And he told an audience at Stanford, it's Russian roulette. Every decade you put in another bullet, you give it to your grandchild and you say, pull the trigger. We would never do that to our own grandchildren. And then he shrugged in front of a Stanford audience and he said, we're doing it. So one of the things that has tended to make the scientists involved with this issue anxious, to make them frustrated, is that there doesn't seem to be progress. And it was phrased really beautifully by the scientist Sherwood Rowland, who his story is a wonderful one in that we have the luxury of forgetting it. There was a problem with the ozone in the 1980s. Do you guys, anyone here remember what happened? In the late 20s, there was a new class of chemicals created, chlorofluorocarbons. And in the 1970s, a young scientist named Sherwood Rowland out of Chicago decided that he wanted to see what was happening with the chlorofluorocarbons. They were being used as aerosol propellants. They were super versatile. So you would have them in air conditioners and you would have them in refrigerators. And people were using them for shaving cream and for hairspray. And there's sort of there's a lovely question that Vladimir Nabokov in his 50s, he was speculating on the disposition of a piece of gunk that was removed from his eye, his left eye, in the spring of 1911. And it was sort of one of those haunting, weird questions. I wonder where that speck is now. The dull, mad fact is that it does exist somewhere. Certain branches of science sort of they specialize in those kinds of dull, mad facts. Rowland was wondering where the chlorofluorocarbons were going. And within about 2 months, he and a colleague realized that they were floating up to the atmosphere. The chlorine was being freed. And it turned out that the chlorine in the stratosphere was like a super soldier. It could take out a single molecule of chlorine, could take out between 10,000 and 100,000 of the ozone molecules. And you guys remember that the ozone layer is like the planetary SPF. He and his colleague published in 1974, and they waited for a ban. What they said is, we know the ban is inevitable. The question is just when. And the chlorofluorocarbon industry kept finding ways to evade the ban. They kept evading it for about 15 years until over the continent of Antarctica, a giant hole in the ozone opened up. First, it was about the size of the continental US, then it was the size of Antarctica. It could be seen from Mars, was one of the things that made Rowland especially unhappy about it. And within about 2 years, after this sort of 15-year preamble, all the nations of the Earth got together, quickly negotiated a protocol called the Montreal Protocol, and we began the process of banning CFCs, and the ozone layer began its process of healing. And Sherwood Rowland asked a great question in the New Yorker around that time. What he asked is, what's the point, what's the use of developing a science well enough to make predictions if in the end, all we're willing to do is stand around and wait for them to come true? And so I wanted to answer that question in two different ways this afternoon from two different angles of the book. So the first way that I'm going to begin is with, if I was going to ask you guys what the most famous metaphor for climate change is, what would you come up with? Say again? Bathtub. Think amphibious mammals, or think amphibious creatures. My God, the only amphibious mammals I think are platypi. Frogs, right? The frog. So this is a chapter. This is a chapter about the frogs. There's a famous analogy for gradual change. You've probably heard it. It's called the boiled frog. Vice President Al Gore spliced it into his Academy Award-winning documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, where it's presented as a cheerful animation. Beaker, boiler, disturbingly relaxed frog. If a frog jumps into a pot of boiling water, the vice president explains, it jumps right out again because it senses danger. The vice president is strolling under the kind of starry blue light that suggests a museum's hall of minerals. But the very same frog, if it jumps into a pot of lukewarm water that's slowly brought to a boil, will just sit there. It'll sit there and it won't move until boiled frog. Climate change in this analogy is the worst kind of danger, one that dawns too gradually until suddenly you're outside and the sun's at noon and you're cooked. In the movie, a vice presidential arm scoops out the frog pre-disaster. It's important, Gore deadpans, to rescue the frog. But the point is, he explains, our collective nervous system is like that frog's. It takes a sudden jolt sometimes before we become aware of a danger. If it seems gradual, we're capable of just sitting there. That idea had proven both durable and charismatic, and at the end of the last century, the business magazine Fast Company decided to put that analogy to the herpetological test. They phoned the American Museum of Natural History. They were connected to the right person who said, well, that's, may I say, bullshit. This is the curator of amphibians and reptiles. If a frog had a means of getting out, it would certainly get out. They got on the blower with Harvard. If you put a frog in boiling water, it won't jump out, explained a professor of biology. It will die. The scientist went on, if you put it in cold water, it'll jump out before it gets hot. They don't sit still for you. The magazine engaged heartless experts and they conducted time trials. Frog A was installed in water that was lukewarm and heating. Frog B entered cold water above a moderate heat. Frog A leapt away at 1.5 seconds and frog B got out at 4.2. But another way, and a way that the book tests this, is by substituting news reports for those slow pots. There are two concepts that came out of the scientific reports in the 1970s. We had a wonderful head start on global warming in this country. An early colleague of Sherwood Rowland's, a man named Roger Revelle, he made his warning not in some abstruse place, he made this warning in Time magazine. And he said that in 50 years, our accumulation of carbon dioxide might have a violent effect on the Earth's climate. Again, most of what we know about climate change was known in the 50s. The story was called One Big Greenhouse. At that time, the Times referred to it not as a surprise, but as the familiar greenhouse analogy. And a few years later, referred to climate change as one of the primary concerns of climatologists in recent years. At the end of this story, right in the most, let's say the absolute center of American middle opinion, Time magazine, Sherwood Rowland just said 50 years, we might have this process could have a violent effect on the climate. And of course, 2006 was, I'm just quoting from the Washington Post, at that time, it was the hottest year on record in the United States. By the 1970s, our research had gotten strong enough on climate change so that the National Academy of Sciences issued 2 reports within 2 years. The first said, we need to approach this with a lively sense of urgency. There were a number of other reports, including one from the Jasons. Those are the people who had helped Robert Oppenheimer develop the atomic bomb during World War II. They reformed during the 50s just to become sort of the voice in the ear of the defense establishment. And they said that this was an ominous and real problem. So in the spring of 1979, the White House asked the National Academy of Sciences if they would just give them a second opinion. Is this really going to happen? The National Academy put together fresh eyes. They went to the summer research facilities at Cape Cod, which I imagine is a very lovely place to research. And they came back again within 5 days. They were the jury that brings a very quick verdict. And what they said is, if the carbon dioxide release continues, this study group finds no reason to believe climate changes will not result, and no reason to believe those changes will be negligible. So that is the kind of head start that we had going into the 80s. And I came to think of those, the kinds of warnings we started getting in the 70s, 2 big concepts from those reports. One is urgency, which is the word that the National Academy used in 1977, and then the idea of things being too late. Urgency we can think of as pot A. That's the water that's already warm. And urgency means the problem could probably do with a little present tense attention. And too late is sort of pot B, right? It is cold but heating. And the idea is that even with some warming uncertainties, action now represents bargains in the future. So let's look at both of these pots, right? Here's how urgency made out in 5 different decades in the New York Times. One day after the National Academy's 1977 report, the Times editorial board explained that experts counsel not panic, but a lively sense of urgency. The penalty for doing nothing until a climatic change is actually observed seems too high to risk. In 1989, next decade, the paper reported that world political leaders were rushing to broad accord on the urgent need to halt global warming. Following decade, 1997, the paper asked, just how urgent is the problem of climate change? 1 decade later, 2008 Times editorial, another failure on climate change, and it was as if a used car had had its mileage clock turned all the way back to 0, and it was still 1977. We hope the next president will have the necessary conviction and stamina and a real sense of urgency. Too much time has been wasted. New president, next decade, 2015 front page. Citing urgency, world leaders converge on France for climate talks. Now, the second pot, chilly but heating. This is how too late did. In 1979, the chairman of the National Academy of Sciences Climate Research Board was quoted by the Times. A wait and see policy may mean waiting until it is too late. A year later, the editorial board expressed the idea in the paper's own voice. By the time climate change can be unequivocally detected, it might be too late to reverse the carbon dioxide effect. In 1987, a scientist with the National Center for Atmospheric Research passed along this notion to readers of Time. By the time we know our theory is correct, it will be too late to stop the heating that has already occurred. Another climate expert had this to tell the magazine about the then 90-year-old concept. The greenhouse effect is the least controversial theory in atmospheric science. A year later, in their 1988 cover, The Greenhouse Effect, Newsweek brought the phrase before its readership. If we wait for proof beyond any doubt, it will be too late to take preventive steps. In 1988, The Times warned each decade of delay may commit the atmosphere to future warming, but it was 1989 that became, for the paper, the year of too late. January editorial, there is every reason to take action immediately and not wait until the debate is concluded. February, scientists do not have precise answers about global warming, but if they wait for the answers and they are too long in coming, it will be too late to take effective action. March, the EPA warns that action must be taken now, not after all the uncertainties are resolved. November, experts warn that if the world waits for incontrovertible evidence of major climate change, it will be far too late to do much about it. Same week, some experts, moreover, express concern that the industrialized countries, following a well-documented human tendency, will not take adaptive action until disaster is near, when it may be too late. 10 more days this coda. When proof of the warming finally arrives, the climate will already be locked into a significant temperature rise. In 1995, Time magazine did the broadsheet one better. Too late had already come and gone. And this is in that delightfully titled piece, Heading for Apocalypse. A more realistic strategy, the magazine informs us, some scientists argue, is to spend what research money there is figuring out how best to deal with global warming when it comes. It is already too late, they say, to do much else. In 1997, the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration explained to the Washington Post just how firmly scientific opinion had meanwhile solidified around CO2. There is a better scientific consensus on this issue than on any other I know. In 2001, Science's editor-in-chief wrote, "Consensus as strong as the one that has developed around this topic is rare in science." As of 2006, the tone around too late had entirely shifted, shouldered aside by a new idea, adaptation. England's chief science advisor, Sir David King, told a reporter from Vanity Fair that even if carbon dioxide emissions could be brought to an absolute heel, it would hardly matter. Temperatures will keep rising and all the impacts will keep changing for about 25 years. The magazine continued, the upshot is that it has become too late to prevent climate change. We can only adapt to it. This unhappy fact is not well understood by the general public. Advocates downplay it, perhaps for fear of fostering a paralyzing despair. A Princeton professor of geosciences and international affairs told the reporter, "For 25 years, people have been warning that we had a window of opportunity to take action, and if we waited until the effects were obvious, it would be too late to avoid major consequences." He went on, "Had some individual countries, especially the United States, begun to act in the early to mid 1990s, we might have made it. But we didn't, and now the impacts are here." In 2007, Newsweek offered its own adaptation story, The Far Side of the River, the shore you hope never to see, learning to love climate, quote, adaptation. It is too late to stop global warming. Now we have to figure out how to survive it. Some effects would be so costly, the magazine reported, that we will look back on the era beginning in 1988, when credible warnings about climate change reached critical mass, and wonder how we were so stupid as to blow the chance to keep global warming to nothing more extreme than a few more mild days in March. All of which gave a time cover from that period. Earth is at the tipping point, a touch of nihilist comedy. The climate is crashing and global warming is to blame. Why the crisis hit so soon? Sorry, it's even though I knew that was coming, it's still hard for me to read. In 2008, the Times was still playing the same music. It considered studies on limiting emissions. The same studies also make clear that the cost of inaction will will dwarf the cost of acting now, and addressing the 2015 question, how much trouble are we in? The Times explained, it is already too late to eliminate the risks entirely. Frogs are jumpers. They get out of the water, but whatever new direction amphibian research takes, it turns out that it's only Americans and human beings rather, who have the stamina, conviction, and determination to remain in the same water. So that is one answer to Sherwood Rowland's question. I would like to give an alternate answer too. The Conference of Parties is starting up at the end of next month, and this story begins at the Conference of the Parties. It's about the gentleman that Maurice was speaking about. And this section is called Glengarry Glen Monkton. 3 snapshots from the life of high adventure, as hazarded by Lord Christopher Monkton, the crisp tan and blue of the beaches at Durban, South Africa, when out of the sky plunges the Viscount. This is at the 17th Annual United Nations Climate Conference. The event is called Parachuting for Truth. Lord Monkton, just south of 60, lands on a green banner reading, "The science is not settled," hair doing a crazy silvery dance around his head. A year later, Conference 18, 2012, the sands of Doha, Qatar, when out of the desert strides Monkton leading a train of camels, words pasted against each hump, "Stop climate hype." My lovely wife, Monkton explains of his camel rapport, says animals and children are attracted to me because I have never grown up. Inside the conference, Lord Monkton spots an unattended microphone. He slips behind, keys the button. He is impersonating the delegate from Myanmar, and after the traditional salam alaikum, delivers a 1-minute denunciation of climate science. "Sorry, this last speaker is not a party," apologizes the conference chairman, Abdullah bin Hamid Al Attiyah. "It was confusing for me because was written Myanmar, but when I look at his face, it is not the Myanmar. He is banned for life from all future United Nations climate events. By this time, the BBC has declared Lord Monkton, quote, the high priest of climate change skepticism." Last snapshot, the Viscount of Brenchley testifying before the United States Congress. Already, we have witnessed the daredevil Monkton, also the Monktons of endurance and subterfuge. Here, finally, is the diplomatic Monkton. It is 2010, and to this congressional hearing on climate science, the Democrats have invited 4 researchers. These include Dr. James McCarthy, the Harvard professor who once stood on the deck of a Russian icebreaker amid disappointed tourists to find the North Pole gone to puddle, waves, and a sad breeze. And as their sole witness, the Republicans have imported Lord Christopher Monkton, who brings a degree in classics. He looks very British. The silver coastline of hair, the well-stocked and shirt-raising belly, the upticked eyebrows that accompany you on the journey from boys' school to gentlemen's club. He is grilled by Representative Jay Inslee, now governor of Washington. There is something about a certain type of British personality that resists entering official situations with an absolutely straight face. Lord Monkton is the hearing's only participant to wear a pink shirt. His tie has a sort of cheetah pattern. Inslee, in our national style, favors the kind of necktie worn by G-men in the movies. "Lord Monkton," Inslee demands, "when did you start serving in the House of Lords?" A pause. At home, this is a sore point. "Sir, I have never voted or sat in the House of Lords." A moment later, Monkton leans back with an uncomfortable smile. "So not only have the deniers," Inslee thunders, "they not only can't produce one scientist to deny this clear consensus, they can't even send us a real lord from the House of Lords. Now, I think this says a lot about the status of this debate, which we should not be having." It's a long-standing headache. Monkton is a real lord. He's a new growth lord, the 3rd Viscount of Brenchley. But he is the tall man who wishes to be taller. He uses the Parliament's coat of arms as his own logo. And in the heat of the interview moment, when things get exciting and loosey-goosey, he's apt to throw caution to the winds and explain that he is a member of the House of Lords, only without the right to sit or vote. This has become so frequent that the clerk of the real-life Parliament has taken steps, posting an official letter. Quote, "I must therefore ask again that you desist from claiming to be a member of the House of Lords, either directly or by implication," his letter begins. "I am publishing this letter on the parliamentary website so that anybody who wishes to check whether you are a member of the House of Lords can view this official confirmation that you are not." It took 20 climate scientists 4 months and 44 pages to disentangle the inaccuracies and falsehoods in Lord Monckton's 5-minute congressional testimony. Their verdict was chemical nonsense. And here is a collection of press snapshots. Lord Monckton has become an international counter voice, a denial authority. Representative Smokey Joe Barton from the well-drilled state of Texas welcomed Lord Monckton to Congress this way. "He is generally acknowledged as one of the most knowledgeable, if not the most knowledgeable, experts from a skeptical point of view on this issue of climate change. The New York Times calls him a leading climate skeptic and lists him among the 3 skeptic leaders globally. CNN has elevated him to Al Gore's chief critic, and Australia's Sydney Morning Herald describes Christopher Monckton as simply the most effective climate skeptic in the world." He'd only been at it since 2006, no credentials, no training, which meant that climate denial had entered its decadent phase. It is above all an inventive and ingenious life. We associate titles with Jane Austen and those khaki breeches you wear tucked into riding boots. The first Viscount, ennobled 1957, was Monckton's grandfather Walter. When Edward VIII renounced the throne to marry an American divorcee, it was Walter Monckton, in a castle with sheeted over furniture, who gave his abdication speech a final polish and escorted the shaky king to the microphone. Monckton's father was an Army Major General who stood for office on a strict animal rights platform, quote, "All cats to be muzzled outside to stop the agonizing torture of mice and small birds." Monckton entered public life in 1982, age 30, as a member of Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's policy unit, where he was viewed as uniquely unpromising. "One must hope," sniffed the New Statesman, "that the other appointees will be of a rather higher caliber." After climate made Monckton a star, he'd be written about as Mrs. Thatcher's favorite policy advisor, also as her science policy advisor, because backstories enlarge in proportion to the front story. Who you were then will be retouched to match what you are now. If it's true, Mrs. Thatcher spared the Lord's modesty. In her memoir, The Downing Street Years, given 914 pages of opportunity, Monckton's name isn't mentioned once. He lasted 4 years, earning a name, The Spectator wrote, as, quote, "a figure of fun." Monckton became well known for clothes. It's the way of nobles, turning everything into costume, since one is already in the deeper disguise of being an ordinary 9-to-5 type person anyway. Monckton was a clothing extremist, resolutely sporting the UK power hat, the bowler, during business hours, and then, for the motorcycle ride home, full biker leathers. By 1986, he was out. Then Monckton became an editorial writer of the hard truth variety. "There is only one way to stop AIDS," Monckton wrote in 1987. "Every member of the population should be blood tested every month, and all those found to be infected with the virus, even only as carriers, should be isolated compulsorily, immediately, and permanently, but not unsociably. The isolated community," Monckton wrote, "would be made open to friends and family for carefully supervised visits." Despite this bonus, Monckton endured underappreciation. Quote, "The homosexual lobby said, 'We know you, you're a Catholic, you don't like queers,'" he explained. And it's important to note, as with many deniers, that this was not the panic of the time. The British novelist Martin Amis, writing in these same years, arrived at a very different conclusion. We are in this together now. Monckton complained about dotty feminists. When the first Saddam Hussein fight rolled around, the columns echoed with Lord Monckton's, quote, almost deranged war whoops. Politically, the satirical magazine Punch wrote, quote, he is quite simply barmy. By 1992, he was again out. To his Evening Standard colleagues, he'd been, quote, a source of continual bemusement, an unusual bird prone to bowler hats, mobile phones, wild pronouncements, and motorbikes. But new, less amused management, Monckton was sacked. This drops a curtain on his London phase. Monckton became one of those resume ghosts who haunt every profession. Phantoms padding the curtains, chasing scripts, bothering producers, hunting for their entrance back on stage. In this period, he was reduced to an act of art criticism. Quote, these artists are guilty of the sin of our age, Monckton wrote, a mad thirst for publicity, a loopy craving for the sensational headline with one's own name in it. One sufferer can always spot fever symptoms in another. 2 decades later, Australia's future prime minister complained of Monckton. He is a professional sensationalist. He says these outrageous things in order to get into the press. His byline had the sadness of the wandering man, so lost he's forgotten his destination. Christopher Monckton is a freelance writer who specializes in art and politics. Monckton and his wife had set up housekeeping in a vast lodge in the Scottish Highlands. He tramped the hills and glens wearing a kilt between the leather jacket and biker boots under a ball cap that said, Cock of the North. A Monckton surprise. His second most famous editorial had denounced the people and region. The Scots were welfare junkies, human bagpipes whinging for, quote, a fix of English taxpayers' money. Really, I have always loved Scotland and the Scots, Monckton explained, and wanted to live here. It's the thing about deniers. Opinion and belief become site-specific. Wherever they happen to be standing turns out to be the right place. In a sense, they are the world's champion believers. So began the era of what the London Times calls the Lord's, quote, many money-making wheezes. He floated a business consultancy, Christopher Monckton Limited. There was his James Bond stand at the London casino tables. He and his wife started a gentleman's clothier, Monckton's. The Lord could be found at the King's Road shop, a tape measure riding his neck, speaking not as a science advisor or AIDS commandant, but as a tailor. The boxer shorts are made of the same cotton that the shirts are, Monckton would say, which some people think is quite smart. Then the shop went under. Here was a man of undeniable gifts committing an undeniable act of squandering. There turned out to be a reason. Monckton had been diagnosed with Graves' disease. It gives the Lord's eyes their look of perpetual emphasis, as if he is forever disputing a tennis line call, staring down an argument, or alerting a friend to an open fly. Graves became the floating excuse, the explanation for things left undone. Healthy, Monckton told an interviewer, and, quote, I would have become a member of parliament, served in a cabinet, and made a good go of it. The opinion that medicalizes the life, that delivers a personality into the hands of the doctors. The diagnosis was a relief, Monckton said, because people tended to say I was under stress or mentally unbalanced. He liked to think that the illness had prevented, quote, his, quote, rising to any number of dizzy heights, he told another interviewer. The fact is that I can't go too many miles from this house without falling ill. So it was Monckton who had ended up sick in the isolated community, possibly dying, he said, bedridden for the best part of 4 years. During his ordeal, Monckton and his wife purchased a 77-room castle, a fixer-upper with a trout lake and staff of 6, and into which they poured £500,000 and the sweat equity of a gut renovation. And during these years, you could find Lord Monckton in the press, pulled over for speeding. He was dressed in full motorcycle leathers and explained to police that he was hurrying to court to answer a previous speeding ticket. It expands our notions of what bedridden has to mean. But these bed years also provide an origin story. His mind, freed from the distraction of piloting a body, gorged itself on problems, ephemera, speculation, fancies. When he rose, it was with his big idea for a toy. Monckton partnered with a game manufacturer and created a fiendish 209-piece puzzle. Because it would take forever to finish, he gave it a time swallower name, Eternity. And to make his toy irresistible, this Wonka touch landed him back in the newspapers. Monckton offered a prize of £1 million to the first solver. I think I must be mad, he said. Solve the puzzle and you could be a millionaire, said the box. I am challenging the world, Monckton declared. Solution, he estimated, would chew through 3 years. In the meantime, he would sell millions of units and become rich. So that's one up for Scottish inventiveness, said Monckton, who was born and raised in England. He flew to the 1999 International Toy Fair dressed full-on Scot, kilt, hosiery, a skin dube, the traditional Highlands dagger, sheathed against his calf. Airport security understandably confiscated this concealed weapon. So the Lord launched Eternity with a British Airways knife down his sock. Really, I don't think any denier had more sheer fun than Christopher Monckton. There was no predicting who'd solve his puzzle. It could be an 8-year-old child, Lord Monckton said, embracing the full spectrum of human possibility, or it could be an old granny, even somebody in hospital recovering from an operation. But he could say, who wouldn't? It won't be a computer, he promised, and it won't be a mathematician either. As he'd later maintain about climate, expertise offers no advantage. The puzzle had been specially designed, quote, so a computer can't do it. You can't solve this by mathematics. Eternity was completed in 7 months by 2 Cambridge mathematicians using their computer. Then the Lord had to pay out. Sometimes you live in a palace, he said sportingly, sometimes in a hut. To raise the prize money, Monckton had to put his 67-room castle on the block. This set the newspapers a loopy headline puzzle, which they quickly and cheerfully solved. Who wants to ruin a millionaire? And it only seemed like eternity. And Toff makes £1 million prize blunder. He delivered a Monckton-style speech, each element requiring, like a napkin, its own fact check. Eternity was the best-selling puzzle ever, he said. That honor belongs to Rubik's Cube, 400 million units cursed at and twisted. 250,000 people bought it. The Lord later upped this figure to 500,000. I'm delighted it's been solved. He sat out the prize ceremony due to illness. Years later, Monckton would offer the puzzle as his passport of achievement into climate science. I am a mathematician, he declared to an Australian interviewer. For instance, I invented the Eternity puzzle. We sold shed loads. The more famous member of the solving duo, ranked by the BBC among the world's top mathematicians, An Monckton. Quite an interesting character, not a mathematician. 7 years after Eternity, with all the pieces settled, he would confess that castle loss and puzzle setback had been discrete phenomena. Monckton had cooked the whole thing up as a publicity stunt. History, he reassured a journalist, is full of stories that aren't actually true. Once climate celebrity happened, setting personal honesty at a premium, he reverted to the original made homeless position. He was 47 now, the October age, with a phone always ringing somewhere and the hour tugging at your pant leg. He graded quietly out of the headlines. He kept up with developments in the field of mathematics, and you could find a shelf of Lord Monckton's contributions at Amazon. Puzzle books, Sudoku X, Sudoku Xmas, and Junior Sudoku X. It is in many ways a resourceful and creative life. In 2006, a friend with a London finance house hired Christopher Monckton Limited to investigate the climate issue. I spent a month rootling about in the scholarship, the Lord said. He was never one for library heroics. Asked what university life had taught him, quote, to enjoy myself and that a lot of learning doesn't come from books. No worries, Monckton informed his friend. There was nothing to it. The friend passed Lord Monckton's report along to the Daily Telegraph, who published. It was the news everyone longed for. So many hits the first day, Monckton's piece crashed the server. This is the man of broad experience and mixed fortune. Republicans sat at the witness table beside Harvard's James McCarthy, a former president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, who had taught and studied climate for 30 years. Denial had become the wish-granting idol. You approached on tiptoe, knelt with the offering, work, support, reputation, and received your heart's desire. For Monckton, audience and consequence, readers, and the loopy headline. When he'd become famous again, Monckton told the BBC a revealing thing. Illness had kept him, quote, out of the action for 25 years. This was 2011. The inactive years were the period when he'd written editorials, suggested detentions, turned Scottish, founded a clothier, received and paid speeding violations, renovated and sold a castle, hiked in kilts, marketed a puzzle. But counting backward brings you to 1986, the year he left Margaret Thatcher's service at 10 Downing. It's like getting a good over-the-shoulder view of your neighbor's answer sheet with its intimate math. The illness had been loss of influence, separation from power, and denial cured that. Suddenly, overflow crowds, radio duplicating his voice, newspapers reprinting his opinions, his face multiplying across screens. Success is how many places will reproduce you. It happened fast because the movement needed a headliner, because the Lord is a thrilling speaker. He has that gift for making passionate agreement seem the one civilized response. He gave you the old stuff, the stem winder speech, where you step into a hall to experience all of it. Moments of comedy and outrage, tall, hissable villains, noble, outmatched heroes, and in the end, it isn't the university mathematicians on their computer who beat warming. It's the 8-year-old boy, the bedridden granny. It's Monckton who solves the puzzle. Monckton gave you climate change with the proper ending. A speech Monckton delivered in 2009 has become the single most clicked YouTube address on the science. His abilities ran the gamut. In 2010, Monckton led a joyous Republican crowd in springtime chanting across from the White House. Now I know in American speak you have a word for global warming. The Lord cupped a palm by his ear. Can someone tell me what it is? The crowd. Bullshit. Barack Hussein Obama, the Lord explained, waving a figure, is now hiding behind the drapes of the Oval Office. He cannot hear you. Global warming is the crowd. Bullshit. That's better. I think he heard that one. This is who Monckton, on stage, irresistible, always was. When you know somebody, you generally know them in the disappointed version. It's only on rare occasions when you get to meet the original idea. 4 years in, opponents were calling him denial's #1 spokesperson. He hit notes that would have charmed the anti-vaxxers' ears. The paranoid standards. Climate science's eye-patch-wearing objective was to, quote, impose a communist world government on the world. Stuff that would have brought a tear to Exxon's eye. So what if the whole thing were true? Why not greet it poolside, an umbrella in your drink? It is better just to sit back, Lord Monckton advised, enjoy the sunshine, and adapt. Celebrity attracts detractors. A former Conservative Party chairman set out to correct the record. Lord Monckton isn't taken seriously by anyone, he told a news program. He was a bag carrier in Mrs. Thatcher's office. The hopeful, sweaty face at the back of the photo, bobbling straps and packages. It didn't stick. A physics professor from Minnesota's University of St. Thomas devoted months to harvesting errors in the Lord's Minneapolis speech. Fact-checking Lord Monckton, there's a sand-counting endeavor. The professor had gone at it from a sense of duty, outrage, and neighborliness. Monckton's big speech was in his city. I asked myself, if I don't, who will? The professor said. This guy is a great speaker and he is very convincing. Nearly every point in the Lord's speech was wrong. The professor posted results to YouTube. Monckton's speech clocked in at 95 minutes. The corrections ran 83, like the map in the Borges story that's the same size as the territory it describes. A Brigham Young academic analyzed Lord Monckton's figures. These amounted to, quote, A rather stunning display of complete incompetence, the professor said. He's just making it up. And still Lord Monckton continued his endless tour. He called it his calling. Lost fights exert a tug. The battlefield where your head was handed to you, something compels us to return, raise our inadequate weapons, and reawait delivery. Lord Monckton had first sent eyebrows climbing with his ideas about AIDS and housing. These had attracted a following. After one Australian event, a well-wisher sought out Monckton by the podium. I endorse your stand on homosexuals and AIDS, the man said thickly. They should be locked up. They should be exterminated. In 2011, Lord Monckton made a surprise announcement. Though heretofore not a medical man, he had cured AIDS. Also a host of other debilities. He'd even beaten his own graves. 18 months ago, Monckton told the BBC, I cured myself with an invention which shows much promise. He sat with legs modestly manspread beside a cushion whose stitching said, Lord of the Manor. We're curing people with everything from HIV to malaria to multiple sclerosis. Teammates began to depart the huddle, denial in its reputation-preserving form. Monckton is not the only climate skeptic in town. He does not represent us, whoever us may be. And Christopher Monckton has had absolutely no contact with me, zero. He couldn't leave it alone. In 2014, Lord Monckton published an editorial about gay men who were always advocating their lifestyle, death style, Monckton wrote, more like. They were cheerless, had an average of 500 to 1,000 sexual partners, no mention of his cure. It was high time, Monckton wrote, to end their eerie dominance of public life. They'd, quote, had it their own way for too long. British tab, the Daily Mirror handled response. Gay and non-gay people average the same humdrum number of partners, 6. Yes, this man used to be pretty important in politics, scary. Large-scale flight. This was the old stuff that just did not go anymore. A former political ally wrote that there was, quote, no place for men like Monckton on his side of the aisle. But there was one place he'd always be welcome. That same year, Lord Monckton stopped over at a denial award ceremony, the denier's annual version of the Conference of the Parties. The event featured a performance by Austria's Killes Moore, a conspiracy rapper who offered some provocative challenges to mainstream science. No, it ain't. I'm telling you, you're off the wall. Man ain't causing climate change. Yeah, you. Here was another spot zoned for irony and our final bonus snapshots. One ancient hired scientist hoisting a microphone and in a quivery voice announcing that deniers were correct not only about climate, but about the right approach to life. Another who believed that ozone warming, HIV, and the SAT college entrance exams were liberal conspiracies. This scientist accepted a trophy for voice of reason. The world depends on us, he told the gray-headed crowd. This is a battle we're in, whether we like it or not. Not even a decade, and Christopher Monckton had secured his place among the immortals. Lord Monckton's award, the camel-driving skydiver, the computer-resistant puzzle maker, the self-curer and non-voting member of parliament, was for dauntless purveyor of climate truth. So the other answer to Sherwood Rowland's question is that if scientists like him seed the field, if they don't make predictions and then stay around and wait for them to come true, the space is owned by people like Christopher Monckton. And that is an answer that our period has continued to supply to scientists as famous as Rowland and to people who are stepping into the science now. So thank you.